Hello, and welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast from Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm your host, Rebecca Christie, senior fellow here at Bruegel, and we are going to be talking about Greece today. I have the most fabulous guests. I have George Papakonstantinou, a former finance minister and also the author of my personal favorite book about the Greek crisis. We also have Eleni Varvitsiotti, who has written another fabulous and well-reviewed book about the Greek crisis. And it's something I myself wrote about a little bit back in the day. And it is now 10 years after the last time we had Greek crisis news. So that's a long time. It feels very recently, but it was a long time. In those 10 years, Greece has stayed in the euro. It has had a number of elections, most recently in 2023 for national government, and there's been a fairly stable national government. The country's economy grew about 2.4% in 2024, according to some estimates, which is way better than Germany, for example, and better than the Eurozone and European Union average. At the same time, the mood in Greece seems to be still subdued, cautious, worried about the rest of the world. So it's a time to reflect, I think, 10 years on and acknowledge the great progress that's been made, but also the challenges that remain. George, can you walk people through what happened and why it was such a big deal? We may have listeners who weren't around back then.
Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and with talking to both of you. Yes, I think it's important to realize the severity of what happened. GDP from sort of peak to trough during the crisis fell by over a quarter, about 27%. Unemployment went to over 25%. Youth unemployment was at some point over 50%. And what makes this real for people is if you compare it with other crises. So, for example, you compare it with the U.S. Great Depression 29-32, right? Which we all know was, the mother of all crises, let's say. The U.S. Great Depression had about the same kind of decline in GDP as we had in Greece during the crisis, except that was a V crisis, V-shaped crisis. GDP dropped, and then 2 or 3 years later, it was back to where it was. In the case of Greece, it's a U-shaped crisis. We are now 15 years since the crisis hit, even more, because let's say 2009 was the beginning, and yet we haven't recovered the output lost. So you can translate that into the huge economic, social, and political cost that the country had. And that explains, I think, also why the feeling continues to be subdued. It has been a tremendous shock on the country and on people. So the crisis basically started. The crisis, let's say, hit in 2009 when a newly elected government that I was part of as finance minister realized that the fiscal deficit was not 6% as the outgoing government had announced to Eurostat, but actually more than double that. At the time of it was 12.5%. It ended up, after everything was counted and all the skeletons were out of the closet, it ended up being over 15%. This difference between the 6 and 15, or even the 2% that was in the original budget for 2009 when it was submitted to Parliament at the end of 2008, this was a shock to the system, to the European system. And at the time, Greece was facing 3 types of deficit. One was the obvious one, the fiscal deficit that I just talked about. The second was a competitiveness deficit. Greece had double-digit external account deficit. And the third was a trust deficit, because it was clear that Greece was not being forthcoming about its fiscal data. As even the European Parliament later, in a review, stated very clearly, there was fraud happening. Basically, the data that was being sent to Eurostat and to our European partners was false. And that precipitated. Greece was the canary in the coal mine of a Eurozone, which was struggling already following the US global financial crisis. Greece had much higher debt and deficit than other European countries. Its institutions were weak, and the explosion of the deficit in the 5 years before the crisis was not accidental, in the sense that it came on the back of long periods, decades, let's say, of mismanagement of the economy which cut across the political spectrum. So even though it was a specific government at the time, the New Democracy government, that ballooned the deficit in 2004, 2009, I think the roots go much deeper than that. And they have to do with how we run our economy and our political system for decades.
What was very traumatic at that point, when it was the full-blown crisis in 2010, and the Greek government at the time, George knows much better, was asking for assistance from the European partners, as Greece was excluded from international markets and had entered a sovereign crisis, was that there was no actual mechanism to help Greece. So at the moment, the government took some measures which were few compared to the magnitude of the crisis, but it definitely needed some money, some help from its European partners. And there was no such mechanism to do so. The only institution with more expertise in helping countries in economic distress at the moment was the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The fact is that Greece signed our first package with the IMF and the European partners, but the IMF actually was the one who wrote more or less the conditions of this package. I'm sure George has more to say about that. It was the design of this first package was, and the goals that were set were completely unachievable. I mean, I remember that Greece had to pay off its loans within 3 years with a 5% interest rate, had to get back its deficit from 15 point something percent to 3% again in 5 years. It was like completely unrealistic. So in a way, Greece was the first euro area country to receive a bailout, and it was somehow like a guinea pig, that a test case for the currencies bloc next rescue. And it soon became apparent just how much the Eurozone would need to revise its approach.
I think there's two important issues here. The first one is that Greece, compared with other countries, was facing much bigger problems of the type that I described before, in terms of its fiscal situation, its external, its competitiveness, and also its institutions, and above all, the debt, which was a reflection of all the above. The second was that our European partners at the time were in denial that the Greek problem was not a uniquely Greek problem. It was signaling a broader systemic issue in the Eurozone, which had gone through 10 years of relatively calm waters, but following the global financial crisis in the US and in its transition, the European contagion, the economic governance architecture was unsuited, was not fit for purpose for these kind of crises. We were missing a mechanism for support of countries. The European Central Bank had not decided that it could leverage tools that it had at its disposal. And certainly the countries thought, and a number of countries, Germany notably, thought that this was a Greek problem, that Greeks should deal with it. Now, eventually, of course, that meant that the crisis got worse and that the terms of the first bailout were indeed punitive, because they were meant to placate domestic audiences abroad and to pretend that Greece by itself could, through very harsh austerity, could get out of the hole that it had dug for itself. The reality was that there were a number of issues that were not addressed in that first bailout. The one was debt sustainability. It's not that we didn't know that there was an issue with debt sustainability. It's just that this was completely out of the question for our European partners, and the IMF had to go along with that, and for the European Central Bank especially, that the debt issue would be broached before Greece could prove that it would actually put its house in order, so to speak. This was the response we were getting. That was one thing. And the second thing is that in the very beginning, before the Greek loan facility was created and before this morphed into the European mechanisms that were created for Portugal, for Ireland, for Spain later, there was no mechanism of last resort in Europe because we were in uncharted territory. So we were all scrambling in these first 6 months to do domestically what we should be doing, which is get the control of the fiscal finances, with an opposition that was pretending that nothing was wrong, and externally facing markets where we saw there was a closing window, very fast closing window, of bond markets, making it increasingly difficult for Greece to borrow and service its debt on international financial markets, and a European Union that was not ready to make the leap. The leap was decided in May 2010, initially for Greece, and let's remember that it was only a week later that they realized that what they had created for Greece was not enough to help other countries which were also in the line of fire. Hence the creation of the broader tools, including a year or two later, the European Stability Mechanism as well. So Greece served as, I often jokingly say that Greece saved the euro, in the sense that the Greek crisis prompted the kind of response by other European countries to safeguard the euro by creating the kind of mechanism that should have been there from the very beginning of its creation.
I want to also add and stress here how the IMF had to participate, overlooking one of its fundamental rules, Rebecca, which at the end of the bailout, the recipient country's debt would have to be sustainable. And the Greece's bailout did not address the issue of that so-called debt sustainability. And the absence of clarity on how or whether Greece should be expected to pay back its loans resulted in years of poisonous exchanges among the Greeks and the international lenders. And I think looking back that if Greece's European partners had agreed on this eventual need for significant debt relief at the start, then Greece might have returned to growth much earlier. But this reluctance to concede to the principle of debt relief was, I think, partly due to their having other priorities, namely to also French and German banks holding a large share of Greek bonds and at the time, and partly also to their wish to ward off the feared financial consequences such a decision could have.
I have a slightly different reading from Eleni here. Fundamentally, I don't disagree, but I have a slightly different reading of the situation. I think that politically, legally, and economically, it was impossible in May 2010 for the program to include debt restructuring. Politically, because at the end of the day, these are political decisions. And the mood around Europe was, Greeks have to show us that they're serious about this before we actually forgive some of their debt. Economically, because we saw later that the debt restructuring requires a year to prepare. Greece was facing a cliff, and we had to make sure that we don't jump off the cliff in May 2010 by buying us time through the kind of support mechanism. And legally, again, because it is a very complicated thing to do. It takes a longer time to organize. Now, one can argue that you could have started this process not a year and a half later. Partly it had to do with the change in the IMF and the transition from Strauss-Kahn to Christine Lagarde. We could have done it earlier. But I think it is understandable that the first bailout did not include debt restructuring. Now, having said that, the first bailout could have had better terms, meaning a longer period for repayment. Some of these were corrected along the way. For example, lower interest rates were given a little bit later. There was an extension of some of the terms. But the first bailout was written under duress. Remember, there was not supposed to be a bailout in the first place. So the creditor countries, Germany, first among them, but also the Netherlands, Finland, were insisting on very extreme terms that were bordering on the impossibility. But you have to remember that the ability of a program such like this to fulfill its expectations also depends on external parameters. One of the things that made the first program, yes, the internal part of some of the parameters internally the program were not realistic. At the same time, what hurt the program very much were the continuous conversations around Europe about the possibility of Greece exiting the Eurozone. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. To the extent that the markets know that there is a denomination risk looming, they will not be convinced that what you're doing is going to bring you back to sustainability. So Germany made a huge mistake, political mistake there, which is that to push the Greeks, it kept saying, well, if you don't do what we're saying, if we don't follow the program, you may skid out of the Eurozone. But once you say that and you don't throw all your weight behind the efforts that Greece was doing, then automatically you're undermining the program because you're telling the markets, you know what, you shouldn't really come back and fund Greece because Greece may not come out of it after all. So at some point, the narrative of a debt restructuring who absolutely became dominant. And that's why in 2011 and then in 2012, in the second program, it was clear that there had to be a debt restructuring component, and Greece went through the largest debt restructuring exercise ever in the world. We shaved about 100 billion off the debt, but then we had to recapitalize Greek banks with about 50 billion, so the net reduction was not that much.
I want to unpack some of that as we head into the next phase of our podcast. First, there is a difference, I would say, between debt relief, which can come from any source, and debt restructuring, which is specifically going after existing bonds. Certainly in the United States, at the beginning, there was a sense that the European Union was not moving fast enough to handle the market panic and was obviously not coming up with enough resources to answer the crisis. There was a view in the U.S. that having too small a rescue package would result in the need for a larger rescue package later on, which happened. Listeners may remember that Greece went through the rescue package cycle 3 times using different facilities. There was the original one, and then there was another one, the second one in 2012, which included the restructuring, and then that fell apart at the end, which we'll come back to. And so then there was another showdown with a new set of political actors in 2015 that really did almost lead to Greece coming out of the euro and the euro really falling apart. And in the end, people came together and got it done, but it was very touch and go. Coming back to the question of political will and needing to do things politically, I think what George said about the euro having survived because of Greece's experience is true, because this iterative sense of how much are we going to fiscally do together, starting out with some small loans from the Commission, heading to some privately issued loans that were sort of issued through euro government balance sheets, then a real euro area facility, but still not really part of the EU. All of this led over time to Europe feeling more comfortable borrowing together, which led to the very successful pandemic borrowing program that we have today. That probably would not have passed political muster had people not grown comfortable with it, because the treaty has not changed over this time. And yet, as some of the more conservative countries, the Finlands, the Germanys, saw that other ways of acting jointly and fiscally didn't work, they felt a need to move together. Let's jump back to the second bailout program. So we had the first bailout program, too small. And by the way, there's a debate whether it should be bailout or rescue or assistance. For the purposes of this podcast, we'll use them interchangeably, but listeners at home do think about what they mean and what it might mean for who's saying it and why. So we have the second package. It was pretty big. It included this huge private sector bond restructuring. It went pretty well. The euro didn't fall apart in the end, although this took a lot of preparation, a lot of considering. And then at the very end, the program fell apart. Do you guys think that was a mistake by the EU not to help that program, not to help Samaras, the prime minister at the time, get it over the line?
I think they felt like the government at that moment had lost steam, that there was a reform fatigue, as they call it, that Greece had gone through so many reforms in the past 4 years at that moment. Yes, 4 years of the crisis. And that maybe this government could not complete what was asked, although the government at the moment was asking for more time. They were not saying that we're not going to fulfill all the commitments, but give us more time. It was also the end of the IMF program. So what the government wanted then was to end the European part of the program as well, so they could show that there's this significant victory. Don't forget, at that moment, Syriza, a small radical party until 2012, was led by this populist but charismatic politician, Alexis Tsipras, was already second, was the opposition party. And he was going and saying that Greece's debt would be largely written off, that the austerity could be brought to an end without sacrificing Greece's membership of the Eurozone. Things were brewing also inside Greece. And also, I think Tsipras was going around European institutions saying that, listen, I'm not part of the old establishment. I will go against the big interests. I will go against the Greek oligarchs. I'm going to tax everyone. You have to trust me. So until that moment, governments and politicians had said things that they're going to end the austerity or they're going to do things differently. But soon they realized that, if we want to be part of the European family, you actually need to follow the recipe. So Europeans, I think, thought that even if Tsipras comes into power, he's going to say these big words, but soon he will realize that, if you want to play game, if you want to play ball, you have to follow the rules, which eventually happened, but it took much, much longer than in the previous cases, with a huge, leaving a huge debt to the Greek economy. And but I'm sure we're going to go into more detail into that.
Rebecca, here at the School of Transnational Governance of the European University Institute where I teach, I run a crisis seminar. And one of the things that I do is we do a simulation exercise on the first Greek bailout, knowing, of course, what happened. Now, it's interesting that the result of this exercise always gives you a much better first support package than the reality one. Longer terms, longer adjustment period, less austerity, with the benefit of hindsight, of course. And what I tell my students always is that when you think about crisis, you have to remember that politics is the eventual decider. As an economist, I can see, and as I could at the time, that we needed slightly different terms. I could see how there was a window of opportunity for the first package to actually be successful in getting Greece back into the market. And I could see how the second package, if handled properly towards the end, would not necessitate a third package. But you cannot abstract from politics. And the reality, as Eleni just said, is that the Greek society had gone through some extremely difficult years, that there was a radicalization and a total rejection of the packages, which the Europeans didn't really see coming. They downplayed, I think, in terms of the structure of the packages. And I think they paid for this, because at the end of the day, they had to put up more money that they would have eventually if they had constructed packages which were more politically palatable. And that's how we ended up with a third package with Syriza, which with a huge additional cost to the Greek economy and to the Greek people, with a U-turn, with a referendum that we all remember in 2015, where within 1 week Greeks were asked to vote yes or no on an obscure text that nobody understood, but actually they were voting yes or no to how has my life been over the last 5 years? And they said overwhelmingly, my life has been terrible. So they voted no. And then the government went and ignored that vote and concluded the third package, which in many aspects was much harsher than the first or the second package. And yet that same political party won elections 3 months later. So, politics in its kind of most raw way is, in the end, what adjudicates these kind of crises. And in a certain sense, it's hard to see how the Greek crisis could have been resolved without going through an episode such as the one that we went through Syriza in 2015. In a certain sense, all the false narratives about easy solutions with no cost, about the availability to get out of this mess that we had landed in without sort of significant sacrifices by everyone in Greece, had to be tested by reality. And it was tested by reality. And in the end, after, the Syriza government pretty much followed the recipes that the two previous governments had followed, and the ones that had radically opposed while in opposition. The New Democracy government during the second bailout followed the recipes that the PASOK government had during the first bailout, and despite its vehement opposition. So we had to go through this. It is unfortunate that we did, because it involved a much higher cost. But it's hard to see, given the Greek political system, given the toxicity around it, given the difficulty of oppositions to even entertain the idea that they can agree with the government on harsh decisions, as they did in Portugal, right? Because in Portugal, they had a much more consensual approach to the crisis. We did not. We had a totally conflictual approach. So we paid for it in terms of harsher terms, bigger reduction in GDP, and a much longer period to get out from the crisis.
And I think, Rebecca, that's the reason that Greeks in these years tried all political parties, from the center-right to the extreme left, and coalition government, which was not a thing of the past in Greece. I mean, They tried everything, and they saw the illusion did not exist anymore. The illusion that we can be part of this European Eurozone family without paying a high price. I think this whole disillusionment came at a high cost. And some European officials estimate the cost, especially of this period, of the Syriza period, the 7-8 months of negotiations, at 100 to 200 billions, because of the cost of the economy in general. Let's not forget that we have had closed banks, we had capital controls, that the banks collapsed in a way. You had banks who lost completely the value of their shares held by the state. So, I mean, that was a very hard hit to the Greek economy at a time where the Eurozone economy was actually flourishing. So at a time when things were looking good for the European economy, Greece was still in deficit. So I think that Greeks, in order to try every single possible solution and in every single possible party, paid a very high price.
My memory of that time is that people were taking 50% pay cuts to keep their jobs, that individuals were supporting entire families because they were the last ones standing. Can you talk, Eleni, a little bit more about the human cost of this time?
I mean, it was really, really depressive to be in Athens these days. You had daily demonstrations in the very center of the city, in the Parliament Square. You had concentrations of people who were there camping every single day, talking about the crisis and protesting. You had protests which led to Molotov bombs and destroying private property happening, strikes happening in a weekly basis, Rebecca. This was like bread and butter for Greeks for a couple of years, actually, not for a few months. You would see people in the streets going and checking and looking for food in the garbage cans. That was a very common sight. You had families that were supported only by the pension of a grandmother. Unemployment rates were extreme. They were the highest in Europe, and especially in youth unemployment were 50%, I think George mentioned. So you felt like that there's no future in this country. And then again, the political debate was so toxic in Parliament and outside Parliament that, you know, the collective energy of the country was very dark. And this lasted for quite some time. And if you think what also George said, which is an insane amount, if you put it into your mind, that 25% of the country's GDP, but also collective GDP, each one of us lost 25% of their value, of their fortune, of their salaries, of their income. It's an insane amount for a very short period of time. It's a shock, actually.
At the time, I remember the German finance minister in one of kind of the moments of honesty, saying to me, if we had tried to impose in Germany nominal reductions in public sector salaries of 25 and 30%, which is what you guys did, we would not be able to survive. And that's what we did in Greece. Now, you can argue, of course, that some salaries in the public sector or some pensions were not commensurate with the ability of the system to support them or with the productivity and the like. Yes, you can argue that, and that's. But the bottom, I mean, at the end of the day, you are basically telling people who were living at had a particular standard of living that from one day to the next, that standard of living collapses. They have obligations, they have loans, they have kids in schools. And in an economy, in a country which is not exactly renowned for its public services in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of social security. And I don't mean just the level of pensions, I mean more broadly, the social safety net. So in that environment, it was an absolute shock. Now, a big part of the shock was unavoidable. I mean, I think that it's important to stress that Greece was living, and a large part of the population was living above the means of the system being able to support it. Certain salaries in part of the public sector, and certainly public sector companies, were completely out of whack with the private sector or with what those companies could sustain. Just they were piling debt year after year. Pensions, the pension system was due to collapse in a few years. So in economic terms, it is totally understandable how a lot of what was done had to be done. And I leave aside the structural issues, the structural reforms, which were almost all absolutely necessary, right? But in human terms, of course, this created a huge problem for families across the country at all levels, from sort of low income to medium and high income. Everyone was hit, and was hit very hard.
As we move into the last section of our podcast, I'd like to spin it forward some. Can you each talk about what's happened over the past 10 years and where you think we are today and how we got there?
So let's say that following the ill-fated referendum and in 2015, the almost skidding out of the Eurozone, which was averted at the last minute, and which, by the way, would have an absolutely immeasurable cost, because there are still a few people who say, oh, maybe Greece would have been better off outside the Euro. No, it would not have been. And the fact that Greece managed to put itself together and grow afterwards shows that this was the right decision to take. So following that, the economy started rebounding, and it had growth of between 1 and 1.5%, and then recently after COVID, going up to 2%, 2.5%. So in a way, of course, this is good news. And at the same time, you've had the taming of the twin deficits, internal and external. Greece ran fiscal primary surpluses, and a lot of the external account was the imbalances were dealt with. Not completely, but a lot of them were. And at the same time, you had a lot of accompanying reforms in product markets, labor markets, in financial markets. Now, so there is a lot of good news there. At the same time, the growth in the first period of these 10 years was not very robust. And today, the growth which exists, by all accounts, is better, but it's not going to last. The difficulty that we're facing is that the underlying growth potential of the country, according to all analyses that are out there, is not better than 1 to 1.5% at best, probably around 1.25% over the medium term. That is a problem, because that means that Greece cannot grow itself out of the debt pile that it has, and it cannot bring enough prosperity to the people, especially when Eurozone countries around it are growing much faster. Greece is, at the moment, the second poorest country in the EU, and the poorest country in the Eurozone. So it has not recovered that ground, and it is not growing at a level that it can recover it. And there we have to, as an economist, I simply look at the growth rates and I say, okay, so what's behind that? Productivity growth has not been growing fast enough. And we can ask the question, why, after all the reforms that have been happening over the last 10 years, these have not translated into productivity gains? And the second is that employment is not growing fast enough. Which opens a whole discussion about the role of immigration into the country and the need to expand employment through, of course, more participation, especially from women, which is lower than the EU average, but also new entrants into the system from immigration. So there's a huge discussion, and I'll let Eleni come in first here before I come back with some of the other issues.
No, I think we just need to zoom out and think, what was the main purpose of Greece's bailout? Was actually to help the country avoid a default and enable to regain market access by putting in somehow its finance in order. However, I remember an EU official telling me that, our country's budgetary problems are simply the tip of the iceberg. And behind these numbers, there were decades of mismanagement, weak institutions, flimsy state structure. So fixing Greece's budgetary imbalances, which what the three programs did, only scratched, I think, the surface of the problem. And it's true that the deficits have turned into surplus, and actually we are one of the above average growth in Eurozone, a country that is doing pretty well at the moment. But I'm not so sure that the real deep problems of the state in areas such as justice, competitiveness, tax evasion, maybe to some extent, and functioning of the independent authorities have actually been addressed to the core. And so despite these interventions and all this pain we had during that crisis decade, we saw that many times there was a lot of nitpicky approach by the institutions when it came to overseeing the implementation of certain reforms. I think institutions just zoomed in into just doing well with your budget, regain your market access, but they didn't go into areas where it was beyond the fiscal adjustment. Maybe this was not the mandate anyway. So some steps have undoubtedly been taken towards building a modern and better functioning administration, but Greece is still in many ways long way from catching up with other Eurozone states. And we see it now that, still, although we are growing, we're still far from what we should be feeling and living and being and having, being competitive and producing things and, being a fast growing economy.
So I think that there's three problems here going forward. The first one we've already touched upon. It's low growth, which comes down to low productivity. It comes down to the fact that the sectors that are growing are around, for example, tourism and the like. Manufacturing is not growing. Infrastructures are not growing. IT and everything around tech is not really growing except for some individual examples. So there's a question of lack of transformation of the productive fabric of the economy, which bodes ill for the future. That's the first problem. The second problem has to do with the fact that whatever growth has been, it has not been felt by people to deal to their own needs. There's increasing inequalities in Greece. There's an increasing sense of not participating in what's happening. The 2/3, 1/3 story is now becoming 3/4 to 1/4 or even more. And a lot of what, to the outsider look like great investments, for example, or initiatives, do not get translated into purchasing power for Greeks who continue to have very weak education, health, social security services. So that's a bomb waiting to explode, which I think is there, and it is the dissatisfaction is growing. The third issue has to do with institutions, and Eleni also talked about and touched about it before. We have not used the crisis as an opportunity to do a serious reform of a number of institutions. We have done some things in public administration, but by no means enough. We have done very few things in the justice system. Rule of law continues to not be what it should be. International analysis show that the freedom index in Greece continues to be very low, and that goes from media freedom to the freedom related to investments and security of investments. And the political system has not really renewed in any fundamental sense. And that is, again, something which is extremely problematic because it shows the limits of the kind of growth that we're seeing at the moment. Because if you don't resolve these deep-seated problems, your growth will be rather shallow, and you are going to be, again, the weak link in any kind of upcoming risk. Because let's face it, we're headed, global risks are on the rise. And if Europe engages in a trade war with the United States and with Japan, if we have problems around energy prices, if we have geopolitical problems in the area which sour economic sentiment, Greece is the weak link here, and we're going to be touched much more than other countries.
Think if, again, you zoom out and you think what Greece went through, 10 years of hardcore austerity, of a nation that was split at some point with a referendum, I had friends who voted no, and I deleted them from Facebook. When, I'm just describing how intense feelings were at the time in 2015, 10 years ago, in recession, with banks closed, with what we mentioned, 25% of the total GDP of the country being wiped off, political instability. And now you are 10 years later, not that long after that. I mean, it's not such a huge amount of time. And you have a country that has a very stable political system. There's a one-party government. There is no rise of the extreme right. The country is growing above the EU average. There is some kind of optimism. So I think that this storm that happened did not destroy the core of the country. I mean, the social core, the political core, the country is functioning, is part of the Eurozone, is growing. It could have been lethal, as George said, what Schäuble had told him in the past, that if this had happened in Germany, people would be out burning the whole of the country. I don't know what exactly he said, but it shows that Greeks are very resilient. And I think it makes sense that we've been around for a couple of thousand of years and we're still here. We are a resilient people and we manage through.
Greece consistently comes in at the top or toward the top of hardest working populations in Europe in terms of hours worked and entrepreneurial ideas and things like that. And that resilience, it's only been 10 years and it feels so immediate for those of us who were in the crisis. And yet there's been a lot of rebuilding. George, what do you think?
I think resilience is a key word here, and it cuts across many, many things. First of all, resilience of Greek democracy, right? Because Greek democracy, it's not perfect, but we have an absolutely functioning democracy, a parliamentary system, which has withstood, some pretty dramatic times. Then resilience of Greek people themselves, who went through hell and back and continue to live their lives and are now more hopeful for the future. Then resilience of the Greek economic fabric. A lot of Greek companies managed to survive and now finding new markets and the like. So I think that's the legacy of, if I can criticize, let's say, the fact that one of our main problems in going through the crisis is that we still have not agreed on a narrative of what caused it and what could have been done differently. I can certainly point to this resilience as being the most positive legacy of the crisis. Now, having been resilient, however, should not make us blind to the fact that we continue to have a number of pretty serious institutional and kind of framework problems that we need to address. Because if we do not address them, the fact that we've been resilient does not mean that we won't lapse again into another crisis and a different one, perhaps with different characteristics, but a crisis nevertheless, if the global environment sours on us. So yes, resilient, absolutely looking, Greece is a different country than it was. It has lost an opportunity to transform itself more radically. It's never too late. It is an ongoing process.
Thank you so much. You've been listening to The Sound of Economics, talking about Greece 10 years after sort of the high point, conflict point of the Euro crisis. 2015 was the last showdown. I'm joined today by Eleni Varvitsiotti. Her book, The Last Bluff, is available in English and in Greek, and you can also read her work in the Financial Times. George Papakonstantinou, who is represented in many, many recaps of this, but his book Game Over is really worth your time if you're looking for a book. If you're looking for the history of specifically EU borrowing and the debt instruments, you can check out The Official History of the European Stability Mechanism, which I wrote, available for free download. And all of our other stuff at Bruegel.org. Thank you so much for sticking with us. Thank you, Eleni and George, for joining us today. And thanks again for sharing your memories with us. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.